Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to have you on our Cuppa Club webinar today. My name is Lisa Ashford. I'm CEO of FX. Welcome to the Cuppa Club. We're going to be talking to a really interesting panel today who are going to tell us about music venue properties and the important movement of trying to save grassroots music venues and secure them as essential parts of thriving communities across the UK. FX is not, this is not unusual for FX actually. We have supported a number of music venues in the past, including the Exchange in Bristol and the Hive also. And so today it's really great to talk about how we supersize that movement and really create important support for these important venues across the UK, often in harder to reach communities, and creating really thriving communities around this music base. I've got a really good panel with me today, which I will ask to introduce themselves shortly. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. We will be recording the webinar today. We will send out a follow-up email with some links if there's anything additional that will be useful for you to know. We'll be looking at some slides today to talk about the proposition and to tell you a little bit more about the context of why we're here today. I'd just like to remind everyone this isn't a financial promotion, it's purely informative. We can't provide any individual financial advice, and if you have any specific questions relating to the session today, please feel free to send those questions to us in the chat function. I will feed those into the discussion as we get going, if I can, or we will have a Q&A session at the end. And we'll have about 45 minutes for the discussion today. So without further ado, perhaps I could ask you guys to introduce yourselves in the order of, let's go Mark, Matt, and then Hugh, and then we'll get cracking on the conversation.
Yeah, hi, thanks Lisa. My name is Mark David. I am the CEO and founder of Music Venue Trust, and we'll tell you about Music Venue Trust in a little while. I'm
Matthew Oatridge. I'm the ownership coordinator for Music Venue Trust, and prior to that I was the founder of the Exchange, who hosted their share offer on FX.
Thanks, Matt.
People are still saying they can't hear things in the chat, but let me try again. I'm Hugh Rollo, a long-time social investor through Key Fund, social investment business, and founder of the Community Shares Unit. And I was delighted to be asked to join the MVP board as a director earlier in the year.
Great, thank you. Mark, can you just go again, just so that everyone...
Sure. My name is Mark David. I'm the CEO and founder of Music Venue Trust, the charity that is, has created this project and is supporting the creation of music venue properties.
Lovely, thank you. And as we were saying before, this is a really exciting proposition, and delighted to have everyone on the panel today to give us some more information. Grassroots music venues are something that FX thinks are extremely important to building thriving communities. And so without further ado, Mark, you're going to take us through some slides, which will give us some great context of the discussion today, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, great. Matt, if you want to share the slides and join in at any suitable points that you feel you can add to. Screen sharing now. So we don't want to spend too much time on a slideshow. Do you want to get to the front? But we thought we would give you some background on what Music Venue Trust is, why we've highlighted on this project. So Matt, do feel free to join in whenever I start to flounder. Music Venue Trust was founded in 2014. It has the specific mission as a charity to protect, secure, and improve grassroots music venues. And by those venues, we kind of mean the ones that, as Lisa said in the beginning, you know, they're spread right across the country. We represent 950 of these venues. They play a really key role in their communities. Why were we formed? Well, actually, there was a huge downturn in the number of these venues trading in the UK, around about 35% downturn in the number of trading venues between 2007 and 2015. And that led to the creation of Music Venue Trust. And over the last 8 years since we were created, we've done a lot of different projects, attracted a lot of different supporters. We've done a lot of work with government, done an awful lot of work with music industry, but most importantly, we've done a lot of work with fans, with audiences, with people who really do care about these venues. Next slide, please. The really key issue for us is that these are not just about, they're not just about the economic impact, they're not just about the importance of the public. They do a wide number of things that are really important. And what we've seen is when communities lose their music venue, they not only lose access for artists, they lose access for audiences, but a number of other things that happen around these venues, support for local communities, support for all kinds of causes, actually falls away as well. So what we've done is really to think about them holistically, you know, what do they actually do? So we identified what were all the kind of problems that they were facing. And ultimately what we started thinking about is what really needs to happen? What actually needs to happen in order for this sector to be better supported, to survive, to actually thrive in the way that it should be able to? What were the factors dragging it down? And you can see on the right of the screen, there are a number of things that we were looking at, you know, that actually they're undervalued, they're not really recognized in the way that you think. But ultimately, a lot of the things that we deal with, and it will be surprising maybe to some people to realize that even things like noise complaints, even things that don't seem to be connected to the ownership of these buildings, actually they eventually come back and they revert back to this issue of how did these buildings emerge? Who owns them? How are they owned, or how are they leased? What security do they have? And I would say that even on things like wanting to see carbon neutral venues or venues that are addressing waste and sustainability, well, actually, as we'll come on to, very, very few of these venues actually own their own building. Their ability to invest is extremely weak. And what we've seen is that these buildings are largely owned by private landlords or private companies who are essentially just seeking a great tenant that can pay them lots of money. And I like to say that actually, if you think about what a landlord would want, what a freeholder would want, they would like a tenant with lots of money who's very quiet. Well, actually, that's the very definition of what a grassroots music venue isn't. You know, they're a noisy tenant and they struggle to keep their cultural offer open. Next slide, please, Matt. So we thought about what could we do about that. And the first thing we did was we have supported a number of venues to look at their own ownership. Is it possible for them and their local community to bring together a kind of local shareholding democracy, a local community that can buy it? And we've actually put a lot of tools into the marketplace, supporting companies to become community interest companies, supporting the creation of community benefit societies, and supporting people to launch fundraisers to buy their specific building in their location. But at the same time, we also realized there would be a large number of communities across the UK, around about half of our membership, so just over 450 venues, that are located in hard to reach communities, high levels of social deprivation, that really don't have that kind of economic mechanism locally. So what we've done is to look at that and think, what could be done nationally? I like to think of this as being the micro community might be able to save a venue or bring a venue into a safe space by tackling this ownership issue in relatively affluent or even middle affluent areas. But what do we do about those communities where actually very low income, low levels of skills to take on this kind of project? And so we thought, well, okay, what about if there was a national community of music fans, of artists, of audiences that would be interested in owning these venues to protect the touring circuit and to ensure these local communities had the same access to culture as the slightly more affluent areas. And so we created something called Music Venue Properties. Matt will probably have to correct me. I believe it's a community benefit society. Is it now charitable? I think
It's
isn't it,
seeking charitable status as we speak. So we're just waiting for the decision.
Yeah, so it's a particular type of structure. We are planning to acquire the freehold of as many properties as we can, frankly, take them into this kind of neutral, benevolent ownership that Music Venue Properties creates, and lease them back out on extremely preferable terms to the current operators, or in the future to new operators, people who just want the ability to have a building in their community that is dedicated towards culture that they can use to run one of these venues. We've set an initial fundraise of a total target of 3.5 million to purchase 9 venues that we've identified in these type of areas that are at relatively high risk of being put on the open market and lost. There's a bunch of stuff you can read there about, how the share capital works. There's also great stuff on the FX website, which you can follow. There's a big share document there you can read. I don't want to spend too much time on that because hopefully there'll be a few questions. We think this is a great additional solution, and effectively it's best described as we're asking people to invest with us and to create a national trust of music venues. Next slide, please, Matt. How will we do that? We're registered with the Financial Conduct Authority, and that's the correct thing. If you buy shares, you will become a member of the society and a co-owner of the property portfolio that Music Venue Properties will acquire. You're entitled to 1 vote, irrespective of how many shares you own. Very important to understand this is an investment. There is a possibility that your investment is at risk, so you have to pay attention to that. You need to read the share document. We think this is the largest community share offer with most number of premises included in one share that's been launched. Hugh would probably know that better than I will, but this is taking the concept of community shares, community ownership, and building it up to a kind of national project. And so it is quite new. It's quite innovative. We've attracted a lot of political attention and a lot of attention within the community share and the community ownership sector. A lot of people are very interested to see, could this work for grassroots music venues? And if it could it perhaps work for sports grounds? Could it work for other really important community facilities where the community themselves don't have that kind of local community structure to do this work? Could a national agency come in, protect the facilities and the services they need, and allow that community the space to do kind of cultural work that they want to do? So we have laid out a process, as you can read there, of how we're doing that. We're looking to complete this initial share offer by the 31st of December. If that goes through, we will immediately move to acquiring properties, which is just a process we've already got laid out. We have a process for doing that. And we're also working with each of these 9 operators about their own structure. So we're aiming that each of these venue operators become a community interest company, so there'll be a not-for-profit entity running the cultural offer, and there will be a not-for-profit entity that owns the building on their behalf and works with them on improving that building, gives them a lot of support. We think, as says in number 5 there, we think this really is an opportunity to really build best practice in the sector, and make sure that artists are going to venues that are genuinely able to support them, and that audiences have facilities they really need, and that these venues are open and accessible and affordable to all. So there's a number of really big cultural outcomes and community outcomes we're trying to achieve with this project. Next, please, Matt. We laid out our goals for this against a number of different agencies. I think particularly we laid out against the United Nations Sustainable Goals. Is that right, Matt? I think
that's right. I think.
Yeah. So, but you can read about that on the screen. But let me tell you what I think is the most important thing of this. I want these grassroots music venues to be able to free up their budgets, their finances, to focus on what they really need to do, which is provide great cultural experiences for the local community and provide support to artists. And what we've seen under the model we've had now for nearly 60 years in this sector is that there is way too much money leaking out of the system on things that we can repair by doing this kind of work. So rents going to private landlord, well, that's immediately leaving the sector. Business rates, well, if we have a not-for-profit entity running a cultural organisation and a not-for-profit landlord, we can work with the local authorities to agree that perhaps they don't need to take business rates on these properties. And in fact, with these first 9 properties, we have already done that in these 9 locations. We can work on things like exciting things, like VAT code 720/49, which is about cultural exemption on charging VAT on ticketing. All of these things will keep the value of the tickets sold in these buildings where it really can do the most good, supporting its local community, supporting artists, giving our audiences affordable tickets. So although we're talking today about, okay, how would you invest? What is the scheme here? I want you to understand this is built on a lot of work that's gone in the last 8 years. How can we create a genuinely sustainable model of a grassroots music venue that's really doing the work that we need to be done in our local communities? Next, please, Matt. I'm just showing you where these first 9 are. As you can see, if you know your map of the UK, if you know the map of the UK, then you can see that actually they're all in areas we've specifically chosen where we feel that that community would struggle to raise the finance themselves to acquire their own building. We've also chosen them specifically to meet government agenda. 8 of these 9 venues are in category 1 areas identified by UK government as part of the levelling up agenda. They are particularly chosen to be either the last remaining venue or the last cultural offer of this type in their area, or the iconic one in that area that leads the other venues and is playing an important role. The reach of these venues is absolutely huge. We've just completed our annual survey, which isn't even on this slide, but your average music venue is providing cultural experiences for 22,000 visits a year. They're still providing around about 174 shows, plus they do a bunch of other stuff about their community, supporting things like rehearsals, recording, providing space for film, theatre, dance. It's not just music. Matt, next slide.
That's it.
And so that's the whole thing. I didn't want to spend too long on that because I'd rather talk to Hugh and Matt and Lisa and see what the questions are. But I just want to finish by saying, look, it's a very big idea. And I think what and Lisa were asking before we started, okay, where are you at the moment? And where do you think you're going to get to? And the answer is, in the 6 months we've been running this so far, we have acquired a huge number of people who are really, really interested. What we need to do is convert those into people who are convinced the project is going to be realised, convinced the investment is going to be realised. And actually what we're able to do privately in things like this is say, well, there's an enormous amount of investment about to be announced, frankly. And we are pretty confident that we can get to our first total that we want to achieve, which is 2.5 million, which will enable us to begin the process of buying properties. And actually, privately, we're fairly confident in getting to the 3.5 million for these 9 properties. That's the whole of our presentation, Lisa.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So I wanted to give, you talked about a whole range of things there, which I think are super interesting, pick up on some specific points. So I'm going to ask a question first around the technical assistance piece, which I think is, I can imagine for these venues is actually quite a sort of lonely place to be in the current environment, actually trying to survive. And so the technical assistance is obviously a key strand to the strategy of helping these organisations to sort of grow and thrive and exist. How will that be delivered?
Music Venue Trust has a training and skills program that we have for venues. We did one recently, that was massively oversubscribed at our national event. We're a huge peer network. Very able to identify best practice and identify, strands of work that are generating income, strands of work that are perhaps losing income but are actually important, how to balance those two things. So yes, we have a team that is dedicated to supporting venues. We also have a a specified response, a legal expert, a planning expert, a noise expert, which is all free to venues that we work with. We are funded by donations and by the music industry itself to provide those services. So that's something we've been developing for 8 years. I should probably say, because it's an ideal opportunity to say so, we first came to this concept fairly early on in that 8 years. But what we realized was we didn't know enough about how to make these venues economically viable in a way that would mean that they were good, ethical tenants, able to pay an ethical rent that would mean there was a rate of return for potential investors. And we did go to market before to discuss with private investors, would they be interested? And most of them said, well, actually, aren't you looking at a very risky set of tenants? I think we're finally at the point where we can say, well, look, actually, within this structure, within all the support we can give, and with the way that the sector has developed in the last 8 years, we're finally able to say, you know what, these would be great tenants for an ethical investor that wants to see great culture in the communities, wants to see a reasonable rate of return. You know, we're not in the market of giving huge rates of return because we can exploit the property market. We're looking at a regular rate of return that's affordable by these venues because we can create the circumstances where they can do that. So yeah, there's a whole range of skills and training that's available to these venues, principle of which in this particular round is support to become not-for-profit entities, which frankly reflects what they are.
So I think there's two interrelated questions that have come in. Firstly, and this might be a question which is perhaps someone, and sorry if that is not the case, who isn't familiar with the Community Benefits Society model, some of which are charitable, some of which are not, but how that can actually pay a return. So, you know, is there some kind of conflict there between being a not-for-profit but paying a reasonable return to investors? And then the second related point, I think, is, and in all of that, how does that then trickle down to paying artists a sufficient recompense for you know, providing amazing gigs and you know, performing at these venues, which perhaps historically they've been the ones that also suffer.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are that we do a piece of work called the Grassroots Pound on this issue of how much artists are paid. For every pound spent on a ticket at a grassroots music venue outside of this structure, 22 pence goes on rent, 8 pence goes on business rates, and 16.6 pence goes in VAT. Realigning this under this new type of structure with a not-for-profit operator and a not-for-profit landlord effectively, we can remove the VAT from the ticket, we can remove the business rates from the ticket, and we can effectively pretty much halve the rent on the ticket basis. So our estimate is that it will be 11 to 13 pence of every pound will go on rent going to the ethical entity. And within the costings that we've done, we've established that that would be enough for us to be able to pay out 3%. So that 3%, you know, we're pretty certain within the numbers we've got that there's quite a lot of things. There's also that's kind of taking me into a slightly different route, but I should cover that at the same time. We aren't only looking for investors here. We have also accepted a large number of donations. And in fact, within the music industry, that appears to be the favored investment principle, that in fact, they'll just donate the money. I think at that point, we should say that our model of being able to return 3% was built on the idea that we would have to pay out every pound we would have to pay 3% on. But in fact, the reality is we're now looking at a model that's more like within 3.5 million, we expect there to be around about £1 million of donations. Okay. And so actually that means we're looking to raise only the 3% paid. So that gives us a bit more leeway as well. So we're quite confident in the model. I just want to finish on that artist thing. I've done this for a long time, and I know artists get very upset about how much they can earn in these venues and everything else. We do too. The way to tackle that is these kind of big projects, instead of arguing about small little things, which we've done as well. Over the course of the last 8 years, we've had big arguments about why do you need hummus on your rider. And it sounds mad, but within our sector, believe it or not, we buy 4.4 metric tons of hummus every year and give it to artists when they arrive at a venue, and most of them don't really want hummus. That's an interesting thing, but that's got nothing to do with how do you pay artists. You have a big argument about that, but you don't tackle the big issue. The big issue of how to get more money freed up for artists, how to keep tickets affordable, is not to be letting loads of money leak out of this whole ecosystem into the hands of private landlords, into the hands of the government in VAT, local authority in business rates. Let's really focus these as being cultural agencies, keep all that money, and that will release the money for artists.
Okay, thank you. So we kicked off the Q&As now. We've piqued everyone's interest. So let's try and get into these a little bit if we can. So there is a concern that when landlords get adrift that there's something major going on here, and that artists are supporting this movement, that actually that could work against you in terms of buying the properties. How are you dealing with that?
I feel like I'm answering every question now, but
I can come in if you want. I guess it's hard to say. That is something that could happen, but equally, I think we're also going into a very uncertain period now, where, and to be honest, the uncertain period has been a bit awkward for us so far, because this campaign has existed against the backdrop of 3 prime ministers, the death of the monarchy. So it's all kind of gone very haywire since we started this. But the things that we're seeing now with these various cost of living, energy crisis, there is going to be an adjustment in property values to start off with. And I think the other answer is that I think it's not always going to be about purchasing that building, if that makes sense. Wherever possible, it needs to happen. But if I look at my own situation in Bristol, I used to run a different venue before we took ownership of the Exchange, and it was really, really difficult because that was the venue I grew up in. That was the venue that meant everything to me. But sometimes, what you've got to realize is the people, it's the teams behind it, it's the community that create these venues. It's not the bricks and mortar. So if there is a situation where landlords are thinking, oh, well, these guys have got a pretty penny, we can charge them 10-20% more than market value. Well, there are other options out there. And, we're exploring things like community asset transfers as well with local authorities, which would allow, if we can start bringing those properties into the portfolio, which is essentially a situation where you get a long lease for essentially free in most circumstances. It would again kind of create a situation where the financial projections would become stronger again. So we're looking at this from all angles. And like Mark said earlier, when we pointed out where Finn was on the map, there is a massive kind of southeast shaped hole on there, and there are issues in purchasing venues in places like Bristol, where I live, or in London, or in the southeast, where the buildings are worth so much, and there are problems, but essentially we need to have the base, the pilot project to succeed, to build upon, to create the solutions for these problems. This isn't a magic wand fix in the first round. This is not even a decade project. This is a project that's going to go decades. So this is something that is pretty monumental, but this is the starting point. This is what we need to get to gain the momentum to go.
Okay.
Can I chip in, Lisa?
Yeah.
From my experience, publicly raising money to buy assets is a double-edged sword. Landlords obviously see that there is money available and might be tempted. But I think the other thing is the publicity that is brought to bear. The idea that if they ask for a change of use, there's likely to be public outcry. Often the public, the engine of publicity helps actually drive the deal. And if I could just give a shout out to my fellow directors on MVP, we have got really good legal, property management, negotiation skills on the board. And obviously, there are clearly plenty more properties than we will initially have resources to buy. So I think we're in a buyer's market, not a seller's market, particularly as Matt said, given the uncertainties over the property market. Yes, I hear what people are saying, but I hope we're not going into this naively, and we understand the levers that we can use to bring negotiations to a successful conclusion.
Yeah. Okay, so picking up on a couple of questions, I think we've sort of covered this a little bit, but let's just reiterate. So, do you see hope that national scale of MVP will be able to address external pressures such as noise abatement? I think you talked about having resources as part of the organisation to really help venues with issues like that. And then there was another question around how do you secure good managers for each venue? And again, I think the technical assistance and training programs probably address that as well. Is that a fair assumption? Anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, in the last 8 years of work, we've learned an awful lot about what the sector's doing really well, where some people weren't doing as well as they could, some mistakes that were being made. I think on that issue of, how do we address these external pressures like noise complaints and everything else? Well, actually, funnily enough, Simon's picked out a very specific one there, which is incredibly complex, and our team is currently working on it with Ben and Jennifer at the night and day. But that one aside, which is a bit of an outlier, there are a number of ways that the ownership of these buildings would actually enable us, believe it or not, to work on noise complaints in quite a different way. And my specific example of that would be, without naming the venue, one specific venue in London has a series of noise complaints that we are constantly dealing with. They are being made by residents who are surrounding the building. Those residents have the same landlord as the music venue. And so at that point, the unwillingness of the landlord to consider what would be suitable tenants that close to the music venue actually is the source of the noise complaint problems. That I don't want to name it because it's quite politically sensitive. Right. But they have moved young families directly above the stage. And that's not something that we would do. So it does do something. But in terms of the broader thing about external pressures, yes, it's a partnership effectively between what we've built with Music Venue Trust and the property ownership issue that we're tackling with this new board with Hugh and his fellow directors around music venue properties. We want to have great people that own these buildings and look after the structure of them. And somebody asked as well about, what will be the nature of how those buildings will be run. They will be run as independent entities under something that we're lovingly titling a cultural lease. And so the key element of their lease for music venue properties as landlords will be, are you delivering culture and cultural creative opportunities to your local community? If you are, then you will have fulfilled the main condition of our lease. And that's very different from any other lease that we've seen on the market, which is always about, are you protecting my investment? Are you protecting my bricks and mortar? Is my building protected? We're really interested, okay, are you protecting the culture in your space?
Yeah.
I come in as well with a really simple, practical example. The Exchange, which we talked about, and the venue that I'm involved with during the pandemic, spent, I think it was just short of £11,000 on 2 sets of fire doors, which is basically, at a practical level, means that you can now sit outside the venue and barely hear that there's a gig going on, whereas before we received occasional noise complaints. The difference between us having the long-term assurance of being there for years to come means that an £11,000 is something that we can do, and also for the other reasons that Mark sort of, you know, said about the community ownership. But for the average venue in our network, they have 18 months left on their tenancy. They're not looking to make £11,000 investments so that then the landlord can kick them out 18 months later and sell it on as a, oh great, look what this venue's got now, you know. So
yeah, really, really good point. I just want to pick up on something which is sort of a bit of a thread through the questions, and also you just touched upon it, Mark, which is around I suppose the innovative side of this project, and also what are you guys doing in terms of lobbying and trying to change the environment in which you exist? So, you know, actually an even bigger picture and co-benefit of this project.
I'm not going to lie, it's been an extremely difficult time to do any kind of constructive lobbying, something you probably had yourself, Lisa, and yeah. I'm sure a lot of people tuning in will find. We do need a stable and consistent period of government to achieve a lot of things that we want to achieve with a project like this. But it is plainly, frankly, slightly apolitical. You know, that actually I think the natural approach to this would be, well, this feels like a kind of left-wing or, you know, community-based idea. There are plenty of people within the government who are quite interested in community ownership. They already have their own community ownership fund, which we have put a bid in to support this project. They have a community ownership strand. I've met with various ministers and previous ministers. The question is, can we create a legislative framework in which this type of nationwide project would be actively supported by government? And I can say we have met with the Labour team. They seem very interested in this. I think they've already announced they're going to increase the community ownership fund by doubling it, I believe, to 300 million. I think this is a kind of project whose time has come. You know, I think we are one of the first people to talk about it. I don't think we'll be the last. I think you will see Theatres Trust, you will probably see Sports England, you will see people like the Creative Land Trust. Everybody's starting to think about this. How can we ensure that there are cultural opportunities within our communities, right in the heart of our communities, when the value of land vastly exceeds the economic value of the culture that's taking place in those? And, you know, somebody also asked about, you know, external pressures. I think actually what you've got to do is you've got to address, if you have a successful venue, music venue or a theatre, that will result in cultural regeneration. This type of project is trying to ensure that when that happens, we keep those cultural entities and we keep those opportunities in those communities that built up around them. Because we've seen this so many times in London. When I first started going to gigs, Soho was the place to go to gigs, and then venues were priced out of Soho and they all moved to Shoreditch. And now Shoreditch, they're all being priced out of there and they've all moved to Hackney. But what about if we came up with this kind of project where those buildings were owned and kept safe for culture to happen in them, so we protect each of those communities as regeneration happens to them?
Exactly.
If I may,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's the magic of community share and aligned patient capital, because you are looking for the right kind of money to protect these venues in the long term. You're not looking to make capital gain. You're offering a modest business return, and clearly it will be run in a very business-like way, but nonetheless, essentially you're looking for capital that is aligned with the mission, which is to protect and preserve resilient independent music venues.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. And then a question around corporate promoters and supporters. You know, have you thought about corporate partners supporting artists as they grow through their early steps? I mean, I know that there is some corporate potentially backing to this project from some big names, perhaps in a slightly different way to the question that's come in, but is this an opportunity to just, can you give us a flavour of those at all?
Yeah, I mean, we've already had what effectively turned into donations from Sony and Warner's and the Phonographic Performance Limited and various other organisations. We have some more of those to announce shortly, which will drive us towards a much larger total than we're currently on. In terms of that specific question, actually, funnily enough, I just wrote a Music Week piece about this, in which I said that the person who asked that question, Simon, will probably know, it was absolutely normal 20 years ago that record labels would put out tour support money, that promoters would invest in artists as they were first building their careers. All of that's kind of fallen apart as digital reconstructed the music industry. Yes, we have open conversations going with national promoters, but particularly with record labels. I'm also just written to the PRS for Music about the cancellation of the PRS Foundation funding, and we're asking them to put that back in because that did a lot to support artists. And I'm also meeting with Arts Council England about more funding for artists to support them to tour.
Okay, what does PRS stand for?
The
Jargon
Performing
busting.
Rights Society.
Okay, thank you.
They represent the songwriters.
Okay. Just a couple of detailed questions around the asset lock. Does that apply to each individual venue or one covering all of the venues? And then there is also a question around what the securitization is against for the debt. Perhaps you could just touch on those 2 points, just dive down in detail for a minute before we bring to a close.
I'll do the debt one. That relates to the debt that's been acquired during the pandemic. And that is an issue across the whole sector, but it isn't shared equally. And basically what we're doing is working with the venues who are hardest hit by that newly acquired debt to work out how to structure repayments, but also, frankly, negotiating with central government who hold a lot of those debts about the ability of these venues to repay those. That's tying in with a conversation about business rates and VAT on ticketing and creating the space within grassroots venues' budgets to repay those loans. So those loans typically are the bounce back loans. So that was, I think it was Peter Lorimer asked that. It's an ongoing issue, Peter, and we're working on that on each individual case. Some venues are very seriously in debt. Others are actually not really in debt at all. And these 9 have been chosen because they are not carrying lots of debt. We will be able to be very confident the venue operator is in a good position to run an economically viable venue in these spaces that we're acquiring. Matt, on the lock?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, is the answer. It was something I'd have to check with the community shares expert who advises us, unless Hugh knows what the answer is going to be. But otherwise, we could send that in the email that follows up. I could, if that helped.
So the asset lock will, I think, cover the portfolio of properties held by music venues, MVP. I think that gives MVP the flexibility over time to maybe move in and out of a portfolio of properties, but the asset lock will apply to all the assets of the charitable community benefit society and will be, through the cultural lease, effectively passed on to each individual venue while it's held in the portfolio. There may be, over time, reasons why individual buildings or indeed individual places may move in and out of the portfolio, is the way I see it. Don't know yet. It's all a fascinating adventure. Particularly interesting for me that the big music industry is seeing value in investing in a national trust, of music venues that is a not-for-profit basis, alongside, obviously, passionate audience, fans, and government. And that makes is particularly interesting as a model to me.
Yeah, and I think that is the beauty of the community benefits society model, to really lock in that mission and lock in who the beneficiaries are, which is a really important umbrella sort of principle to what's being done here.
Yeah.
So just to finish, if anyone would like to just put any sort of closing remarks in, maybe we go Hugh, Matt, and then Mark, if there's anything else you'd like to add.
So obviously I'm a believer, but I am a passionate believer that we need to align capital better with mission and intention, and that there is a wonderful place for this blended, non-greedy, aligned capital to support cultural heritage, pubs, shops, things that communities really need and want. And I think MVP is a really interesting experiment in how we can do this around independent music venues.
Great. Matt?
I think, I just come at it from the point of view of being on all sides of this kind of weird, I don't know how to describe it, but just being on all, as a venue, so I've been a venue owner that's leased a venue. I've been a venue owner that's owned a venue. I've been a venue owner that led a community ownership campaign. And, the difference of what my venue was able to do at each of those points is really just shows the need for this to happen. Like, we're now actually, the Exchange in Bristol is the first music venue in the whole of the UK to achieve gold on the Attitude is Everything charter, which is the Attitude is Everything is about making your venue accessible. So to be able to do that only happened because of being community owned. To be able to, when the pandemic happened, we were like one of a small, what was it, 20%? I think that thing said earlier, 80% were in peril. We knew we weren't in peril because of that reason. We've just been able to achieve so much in that short length of time. And I think the more venues that are brought into that sort of, into this circle, the more potential there is for artists and their communities around them to thrive.
Mark?
Yeah, I think Hugh and Matt have kind of really covered what I was going to say. I think I was just adding, look, this is a passion project. This is for people who really want to see genuine positive change in their communities, and like me, really, and like our whole team, frankly, we're inspired by music. We value music. We go to live gigs all the time. This is a project that's led by music fans, and it's for music fans. It's for people who really believe in the power of music in their communities. And I think the fact that we're able to offer you, an ethical rate of return, and I shouldn't say this because I'll get told off for it later. That's not what I'm selling you. What I'm selling you is a fantastic idea of how we can finally stop having all these daft campaigns about how do I prevent this venue from closing down, or how do I stop that one from getting. This is about actually a really possible long-term future for music in our communities that I really believe binds those communities together is so important to them. So I'm really keen to see people invest in this because they believe in music in their communities, and this is a way that we can guarantee to protect it.
Absolutely. Great to hear your views. Thank you very much to the panel. If you'd like to read more information about this, please do head over to the FX website. We will send up a follow-up email as well. But thanks everyone for listening today, and best of luck with this. And we're delighted to be supporting you and look forward to success. Thanks, guys.
Lisa, really appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.